Hello and welcome to another episode of Oh, What a Lovely Podcast, where popular culture meets the First World War. I'm Angus Wallace, and with me, as ever, is Jessica Meyer, Chris Kempshall, and joining us today is Alexander Jackson. In this episode, we're going to be looking at where football interacts with the war. Alexander, thank you for joining us. You're the curator of the National Football Museum, somewhere I didn't even know existed.
Oh, fantastic. I'm glad you now know.
I did, because I walked past it on Saturday, in fact.
I am not the biggest football fan. I'm sure there'll be hundreds of people out there shaking their heads and rumphing. So you've written a couple of books specifically looking at football and the war, and your latest being Football's Great War. I've got that right, haven't I? That's the latest one.
Yes, yeah, that's my first sort of official book, because I helped, contributed, but didn't sort of write fully, like a small shire book around the museum's exhibition on football in the First World War for the centenary back in 2014. And that's sort of how I kind of got into this particular topic, although I have a sort of a history of interest in military history going back to my undergraduate days at King's College in London. And so when I got to become a curator at the Football Museum and this particular project came up, it was like, oh, sort of things are coming together quite nicely, actually. Yeah. Although having said that, ironically, I never actually studied the First World War at all at university. I was very much like early modern history, like, you know, Spanish Empire, that kind of stuff. So I had to also educate myself a fair bit on it.
I was going to say, in a myriad of football topics, it seems a slightly odd one to sort of turn up with the First World War.
Yes, and it was interesting at the time, because we sort of, when we were planning the exhibition a little bit, that we were discussing whether we should do it in the first place. We sort of had a look through the collections and we sort of found a few things. And we thought, well, actually, we'll have to loan quite a few other artifacts from other museums, like the Imperial War Museum, Army museums. And then we decided, well, actually, sometimes the gap is the opportunity, and that's the right way to take a project. So it's great. And then actually, as we spent more time exploring our collections, there's obviously actually, if you actually look at any team photograph from the early 20s, actually what you're looking at in a football context is actually a lot of probably First World War veterans in that football team. And the same on the terraces. So, and we started making connections and uncovering lots of untold stories, also interacting with people who are doing research within the wider football community. And so the exhibition was like a real great way of getting into it. We covered like the home front, the front lines, soldiers at the front, post-war stories. And then within that, how I got into the book was that sort of the home front story, I think in sort of in common with some of the wider historiography of the war. Football's home front story was sort of relatively underexplored. It was more about players going off to the war. Women's football was the main way in which the home front story got told. But actually, when you get into it, men's football and football generally continued during the First World War in various different shapes and forms on the home front. And so manically, I decided I would research this in my spare time. So I spent like 2014 up to the day sort of doing across like evenings and weekends and holidays, sort of slowly slugging away at the research for this book. But it's been really worthwhile, because I've just found so much stuff. It's just, it's really great. It's really fascinating.
I think it's interesting that those kind of those areas that you flag up, because certainly when I was thinking about it, and I think, you know, I think it's probably fair to say that I'm the football fan of the three of us. When you think about football in the First World War, you end up with a mix of a lot of women's football in kind of the public mindset, particularly after the centenary. I think the centenary did a reasonably good job of highlighting women's football. Football was a recruitment tool in 1914, and then Christmas truce stuff. But having looked over your book, the tension between football as a home front diversion and shouldn't all of you actually be in the army as an ongoing kind of society debate was the question that arose early in my mind about, well, how are they going to justify these? If you're fit enough to play football, you're fit enough to go into the army aspect of it in 1915-16 time.
Exactly, yeah. And that, like I say, that particular tension emerges straight away at the start of the war. And continues all the way throughout. And it's like I say, where in most sort of general histories of the war, especially the big sort of overviews of the home front, it is that 14-15 season that really sort of gets picked out, because it amplifies a lot of these other big discussions about like how do we react to the start of the war? What's appropriate behaviour in wartime? As both a civilian as a man, should you join up? Or if you can't, why can't you? And what should you do on the home front as a civilian, male or female, to keep support the nation as best as you can? Is it, business as usual, that kind of approach, or is it throwing yourself wholesale into all the various different activities? And so football is a great way into that. Throughout, people are sort of navigating that as the whole wider war dynamic changes, in terms of, especially at the start when it's voluntary recruitment, and then those debates change as you get into conscription later on. But they also fundamentally throw up some really interesting tensions that come from the pre-war era about the place of what should football be in English society or British society. Is it an amateur recreation that should be played purely for the game's sake, for the love of the game, with no medals, no competitions, at its purest amateur form, which some people subscribe to as a very, particular fixed mark in middle class society, upper class, through down to is it work? Is it a paid profession for a man to be able to play? Obviously, in that particular context, the concept of women being paid professionals doesn't even exist, and even being able to play is a challenging notion pre-First World War around women. And then obviously in between you have everything around that, as well as you have the whole idea of, is it a suitable entertainment? Because again, pre-First World War, you have debates around cup finals. You can read in the Morning Post in 1910 saying sort of football is like the circus of ancient Rome. It is the precursor to the end of empire. This is like the cup final crowds there are like the crowds in the Colosseum. They are the precursor to the end of that glorious empire, and we really need to start thinking about whether the British Empire will last as long as the Roman Empire if we're going to be entertaining ourselves in these ways. Right down to, on the opposite side, it's the tool. Sport is the tool of as a useful tool for capitalist society to distract the workers from their oppression, down to actually is just sport just a nice enjoyable pastime for people, whether it's playing or spectating. And so when the war comes along, it's obviously everyone kind of takes a lot of people take their pre-war burdens or associations into it, and then they sort of load that onto football and that in that way, which, interesting enough, one could argue you could see that when we had the start of the pandemic, in way that certain politicians took perhaps their pre-existing views of where football and footballers and their money sit in society, and then loaded that on into how they reacted to how we were all reacting to the start of the pandemic and what we should do.
And there's clearly a class element to all of this, which I think comes out very strongly. I was wondering, and this actually brings in slightly the way in which women's football was treated during the centenary, because I remember working on the BBC's World War I at Home project, where one of the stories they really wanted to push for women's history was women's participation in football. And there wasn't a sort of regional element to that it wasn't just about women not doing being more than nurses and potentially more than working in munitions, so diversifying the stories about women, but also about, these are good stories for the north of England. There's a very interesting way in which we regionalize football today. Was that the same at the time, and did that emerge in recruiting practice? Because of course recruitment was very often region based by unit. You identified with the region that your unit was recruiting from, even though Haldane had divorced a lot of the regional associations by 1914. But I was just wondering about regionality in this story.
Yes, that's again one of the sort of the big things that came through and made it researching both fascinating and terribly complex at times, because if you're trying to understand diversity of local and regional responses, and there's not been masses of legwork done, I had to do a lot of it myself, decide which was a suitable number of case studies. It is like trying to work out, is this unique? Is it the same? Is it one can we see differences within a region and a local area, or what in that sense? Specifically on recruiting, it's quite fascinating because you could see, what I should also say as well, that obviously football clubs themselves are a great way into understanding different local and regional responses. And so on the recruiting, you could see you had this sort of rough north-south divide in terms of the very concept of should we play or not play at the start of the 14-15 season? Because obviously the idea that it's if we stop playing entirely, that sends a very clear message to our players or to spectators and other people of like, football as a whole is not a suitable wartime activity. Thing to do now is to concentrate solely on whether you should join up. And so what's quite interesting across southern, soft and relatively more rural counties, although obviously significant urban areas within them, quite a number of those southern counties within the FA structure decide that stopping is probably the way to go. Whereas in more northern Midland ones, where you've got larger urban areas where also actually a lot of the recruitment comes from, they are happy to sort of exist with the idea that, we should encourage recruiting, but we should also offer participatory play for men who can't go, especially if they're going to be working in the factories and the shipyards and all the other sort of elements that are important to fighting a total industrial war. And so that is a quite fascinating aspect within that. Again, it's quite interesting because you do see a different regional development. Some areas are quite strong in women's football, especially the northeast, and other areas you have relatively little. I think some of it comes down to whether you've got particularly strong war industries that are pulling women into predominantly male areas of male employment where women's teams tend to come out of. And other areas, perhaps where it's again more rural, you potentially have less games. But then also sometimes it's trying to work out individual agency as well in that, in terms of like, is it particular women who are really interested in it or supervisors and factories who are encouraging it? And I say, in some ways, I've done a lot of research for this, but then as soon as you start doing anything like this, you start realizing how much more there is to be done.
There's all the links because I'm, in my head, I'm going, and how did that impact on medical examinations at recruitment? Did they suddenly have a lot of really fit people, really fit men coming in, and did that skew things? But yeah, no, it's fascinating stuff.
What I find interesting when you talk about this, the regionality of it. So I've done some work looking at Middlesbrough in the First World War. So Middlesbrough has the largest crowd of 22,000 watching a women's game, which is the largest men's game. Have I got that right? It's 20,000, but that 22,000 is versus Bolcow Vaughan, who's Ironworks, is their ladies team, versus a team from Tyneside. And what is interesting is they split it up as there's the Tyne, the Weir, and Teesside of the teams, and that seems to be the sort of the women's local league, and they're all extremely heavy industrial areas. But when you look at your list, what's not there is West Yorkshire, which to me is there's Sheffield there, but where's Leeds? Where's Huddersfield? Where's these other large northern conurbations? So when you go, well, football's more popular in the north, yeah, but actually, it's very specific where you're talking about for these ladies' teams.
Yeah, so specifically within women's football, you have this, probably it's worth just briefly explaining, sort of, you have a controversial 1914-15 season where football continues at the professional level. And then at the end of that season, the FA has to decide what's going to happen afterwards. And this is where often historians, sort of looking from the outside, they see the FA in the summer of 1915 decide that professionalism within English football, it's not so much professionalism disappears, the payment of professional players is forbidden. Very specific. So you as a director, say Angus, you as a director, you could still continue to, if you wished, like as a shareholder, withdraw some money, receive money as from your dividends, should the club have somehow made a profit, which would have been quite a challenge. Chris, if he was a manager, could still be able to take his money that ways. And if Jessica was working as in some sort of club administrative capacity, she could also be played. If she was like on the gates as a turnstile, operating the turnstile, she could be also paid. But say I turned up to play as a player, it'd be like, sorry, Alex, remember 15-16 season, no money for you. You're an amateur. That's almost in inverted commas. And so football continues after that. The clubs have to decide whether they'll continue or not. And so they organise regional leagues to, again, meet with the FA's guidance on we don't want to interfere with the war effort. So regional leagues continue sort of Lancashire, the Midlands and London. But up in the northeast, where women's football is particularly strong, and there's this biggest culture, as you talked about, been identified by other historians, the northeastern clubs, partly through the distance issues of having to travel further on, especially because you're travelling by train then, so it's quite difficult to get your players out of work and to games. So that's a practical problem, but also actually they have a certain element of moral opposition to continuing the war, because this is, again, regional different responses. Some club directors are heavily opposed to the idea of organised play after 1915, And so the other group, so we have the northeastern clubs of Newcastle, Sunderland, Middlesbrough stopping. And then actually, interesting enough, in round Birmingham, Aston Villa, Wolves and West Bromwich Albion, and for one season only, Birmingham City, all say that we'll only play a small number of friendly games. And so what's quite interesting, actually, you've got two areas. You've got the Midlands, where there's no real big organised teams apart from Birmingham City from 15, 16 onwards, and also the Northeast. And the Northeast, you get this huge big culture of, through 17 and 18, of women's football with like up to tons and tons of teams. But actually, you don't have those teams in the Midlands, which is quite fascinating. You've got the same kind of, you've got big in the Midlands, you've got tons of war work, tons of factories going on. Arguably, you should probably be seeing two similar cultures, but you don't. You see one up in the Northeast and you don't see one down in the Midlands. And then, as you said, like, where is it in Huddersfield? And that's interesting because, again, it's different types of work, because women had been, I think, in the West Midlands and parts of West Yorkshire and Lancashire. Women obviously also had historically been working quite a lot pre-First World War in textile industries. And so you see very, very, very few teams from those factories that already had pre-existing women's workforces. So I think it's something very specific to a degree to certain areas where presumably some factories and supervisors are trying to push that through in terms of recognising that female war workers need recreation, they need activities, and then also those women coming into those environments and wanting it themselves. And also, in some cases, seeing that there are those facilities pre-existing pre-war, because there are the men's pitches. So sometimes it's about access, and this is something about today. It's about how women access physical spaces to play. And so when they're in an environment when they can see them literally like outside, so to speak, or connected to the factory, moving into it is that bit easier. But that's about men allowing women access to it, which then obviously gets taken away very quickly after the First World War, which we still have issues around today in terms of how women's and girls teams are allowed to access physical space across all different levels of the game.
Well, on that last point, in regards to particularly kind of, you know, the post-war ban of women's football, and I think it's in 1971 it gets nominally lifted, is that there's still weird elements of it. So fairly recently there was a pitch invader in a Chelsea women's game. I think it was a European game, and he came onto the pitch and was trying to get selfies with the players, and one of them knocked him over because, God, why wouldn't you? But the guy who invaded the pitch, ordinarily if you were to do that at a men's game, you would be given a stadium ban. You wouldn't be able to go to stadiums and watch football again. He didn't get a stadium ban because, as a holdover of the ban, women's pitches aren't classed as being stadiums and sports pitches in the same way as they are men's. So they couldn't ban him because he didn't go into a football pitch in a stadium because it was a women's game. And that was deeply weird.
I wondered, actually, go back to, I was slightly obsessed with this idea of Middlesbrough being huge. If it's partly because it's new industry. So if you're looking at, now the odd thing is that, so Baclaw Vaughan, with 22,000, Baclaw's a German. He's a German immigrant who owns the ironworks, a German family, which I thought was quite an interesting small tidbit. He also becomes the first mayor of Middlesbrough. And I think there's a park named after him as well that he gives to the town. But I did wonder if Middlesbrough's, and possibly a lot of the northeast, being steel and iron, is new money. So there's more philanthropy going on, and so these are specific factory teams. So there's a Dorman team, is the other one. Dorman Long, Big Steel Works become eventually Bells, become British Steel. And if they're oh heavens, Jessica, you'll know, Mrs. Bell, what's she called? Writes the big poverty report of Middlesbrough.
Oh, yes.
Anyway,
I can't remember.
I wondered if it was all wrapped up in potentially more philanthropy from the new industry than possibly the old industry of West Yorkshire, which is more, you know, mill towns.
Yeah, I think what it is that when they go into spaces where it's male predominant, used to be predominantly male, and there's an element of obviously substitution or expansion of the works, is that in terms of looking after your male workers pre-First World War, there is obviously that paternalism that goes back into the 19th century of obviously like, how do we care for workers, how do we encourage them, how do we develop a sense of like, you know, to a certain degree, like, you know, loyalty to a company. And often within that there's an element of social provision and sports, and obviously that's also about keeping workers healthier and fitter and drinking less, lots of drinking less, and not gambling and that kind of stuff. Whereas I'm not being a huge expert, I imagine that where care and provision for female workers pre-First World War is probably either less or possibly even focused in different ways in terms of what they're done. Because obviously that's what they do. I think that's when they start looking after female workers in those environments. It's about obviously like creches, looking after providing different kinds of recreation. But then obviously some of the women, especially younger ones, are going like, well, actually, quite like to do what we're doing when we're playing in the yard and breaks with like the male apprentices, which is how Dick Kears, for example, start. It's like, we want to play football, and why can't we use the pitch? And so it's interesting to think of Gretna, where it's obviously it's the Scottish, it's mixture of Scottish and English side, the massive munitions works there. They are very, the workers, when they say, oh, you know, they have hockey leagues set up for them, and that's fine because pre-First World War hockey is seen as an appropriate female sport. When they want to start playing football, there is some discussion, I think, amongst the factory authorities of like, well, hockey's fine, that's acceptable. Is football a suitable activity for women? We might have to look about this because we're not entirely sure. But and after a little while, they decide to, right, okay, you can officially use the pitches that are there that we use for the men's teams.
This will be a particularly difficult one, but bearing in mind that, particularly with women's football, if we take Dick Kears ladies as an example, they're a munitions factory team. What happens if they get injured?
That one I've not got into too much. I haven't come across that. And this is actually relates to male players, because obviously, again, when male professional footballers have to become amateur players in 1915, they go back to being what they were sort of in the very early days of, like, you're a workman first and you're a player second in your spare time. And so for male players, it's interesting because I've come across some of like they did at that time have newspaper columns, relatively ghosted or not, depending on your view on those or the background of the players, because sometimes we can view those things as they're totally ghostwritten. Actually, ghostwritten as actually a journalist going around and actually interviewing someone properly and then relatively writing up. So actually, that's a relatively useful resource. And so within some of those columns, you do have players talking about the fact that obviously they're working very long hours, 60 to 80 hours sometimes. And then when I get to a Saturday, like, yeah, I'm knackered, I don't really feel like playing today, might let someone else play ahead of me, or potentially, there's only so much I can do, especially like if the ground's icy. I'm not going to go in for 50-50s in the same way I did before, because if I do my leg in, then I'm not earning money, am I? I'm off work for however long. And so I think possibly come across maybe one or two cases where a female player has been injured. So again, it's similar things like fundraising, or it might be fundraising just for female workers who've been injured in the course of their normal activities. And so, so throughout all of this, there is a sort of, again, that tension of sort of like how much do you put into your play? And now some of those tensions come out a little bit where around the sad case of Bob Benson, who was a professional footballer prior to the war for Arsenal. He then went into war work pretty much full time because he was getting a bit older. And so he went along one time in about 1916, I think it was, to watch Arsenal play Reading. Again, don't quote me on the teams, but essentially went down to the change room, as you might do, say like, all right, lads, haven't seen you for a while. And they were like, a bit short today, Bob, can you just help us out? And he's like, not sure, I haven't played for a while. And they convinced him. So he went back up and told his wife and his father-in-law to come to the game with him. Went down, came out, played for a little bit, and then he started feeling unwell. He had to go off. And he went down to the changing room, was ill, and he actually had a brain hemorrhage, and he died in the Arsenal changing room with the club doctor and his father-in-law. And so afterwards, you have people in the newspapers talking about this, sort of like players and managers saying, like, when you're having a go at a player from the crowd, if you're having a go at a player, you think he's not like quite putting in, remember, they've done really long work, and like this is potentially what happens, because I think they linked it to like, was it a brain hemorrhage? At the time, doctor said it was a brain hemorrhage that happened. Whether it was specifically related to the huge hours they've been put in is obviously difficult to say from this distance, but obviously might have been a factor. And so they were saying with this, like, well, actually remember, like, players are actually workers first, then they're giving up their spare time for you as a civilian to be able to watch this. So if they're not going in for a big 50-50, don't give them a whole load of verbals.
And of course, when players do enlist in the armed forces, that becomes even more the case, because there are, moving away from football on the home front to some extent, that there is also football overseas. There are all sorts of games organised by the military overseas. To what extent does that tension between the work identity or the soldier identity and the footballing identity play out in the military. Did you find?
Oh, it's fascinating. I mean, you could do it sort of two different levels. You could do like literally as fans, because obviously you've got, and again, where I've tried to tap into obviously the pre-existing literature of obviously you've got this mass creation of this mass army. So it moves from being a very small professional force to one with lots of civilians. We're bringing a lot of British civilian culture, which is whether it's like seaside parties, it's like concert hall parties, the music elements of it. So the football is one element of that. So a lot of fans bring their pre-existing fan identities with them and maintain them. So it's like they do that through connections to home, through letters to the home front, keeping in touch with like club programs, the newspapers. Players themselves who played at higher level also take that into the forces, and they still have that identity when they go into it as, Charles Buchan, the famous Sunderland forward. So when he is like playing in games behind the lines or whether at home, players recognise him as a footballer first, not as like, Corporal or Sergeant Buchan. And so it's fascinating because you just see that in some lovely different ways. I think like one of my favourite ones was sort of like, trying to remember now, Edwin Moscrop writing from Salonika, where he'd gone with the Royal Army Medical Corps because he was a conscientious objector. And so he'd actually been granted exemption from... They granted him an exemption from service, and then he agreed, or from combat service, and he agreed to join up the serving as
a non-combatant unit. Yes.
Yeah, they allowed him that particular, and he was willing to follow that particular one. And so he wrote letters to the club secretary, then they get sent on to the local newspaper, printed in the Burnley newspapers. And he was talking about like, oh, it's lovely whenever you recognise playing a game behind the lines, and also whenever you hear a good Burnley voice cheering you on, which obviously anyone who has come across the distinctive Burnley accent can imagine that straight away. And so it's almost like that little bit of Burnley transported all the way to Greece, but it's like they're back home on the pitch kind of thing. And then you get those little snapshots there, sort of, they do connect you with you at an emotional level, because it's lovely. Because I think if anyone who's ever travelled anywhere in the world and then met someone from their home area in a particular one, that instant connection back, taking you back is, and obviously within the heightened sense of wartime and military service and all of that, football is often this great connection for taking people back to their pre-war civilian lives, which is obviously especially important when a lot of these blokes are not looking to stay in the army forever. They are just, this is a temporary wartime disruption, and it'd be great when we can get back. And especially you see those connections maintained through when soldiers come back on leave or when they're in training for quite a while, because that's in different ways, shapes, and forms. That's just a way to tap in for a little bit into the pre-war identity. So it could be coming out of a hospital and seeing your local team play again, or just even recognising like a player from your club playing for another club somewhere else. It's just like all these different little things just pop up. One of the bits that I regret not being able to get into the book, because there's so much good stuff that you eventually have to cut out, obviously really great ones. And it was James Catton, who was the leading sort of English sports reporter of that era. Is like a big name, and he sort of set the tone on a lot of debates. And he often did a relatively sort of personal style of writing at different times. And so there's this lovely description in one time, sort of coming back into Manchester, having gone to a game, and he's travelling with, like, as you would then, there's obviously soldiers on the train, and there's a guy with all his kit, and they sort of get to talking, and the soldier turns out to be like a Blackburn fan, so he's asking James Catton, like, what's happening with the Rovers, what's all going on. And so the guy's back on a 40-hour leave, but obviously one of the things is, like, after seeing the kids and his wife, the thing he'd really love to go is go and see Blackburn Rovers play. So you see just these little snippets of just like these just bits, people just want to tap back into that civilian identity, of which football is one of them in a very powerful way for some.
Footballers are massive celebrities. How big of a celebrity were they at the time? Because I was thinking when they end up in the army, again drawing a parallel now, often it's in the army's interest not to get the celebrity killed because it doesn't look good on the army. Or do you find the reverse happen, that you're trying to put these men into positions where they could say, look at the heroic so-and-so player at whatever battle?
To be honest, so they have a celebrity within working class culture and within their own worlds. They are the super, they haven't crossed over into that super celebrity you see emerge in the 60s with people like George Best, who transcends being a celebrity within the football world to being a celebrity full stop. And he is Whereas pre-First World War, they are still relatively quite rooted in those communities and that class background. They crucially also earn only twice what the average working man would earn. So maximum wage is roughly around £4 a week. You could earn a bit more with long service and additional bonuses, so maybe push it up a bit more. But you haven't got, your wealth isn't taking you out of those communities. Particularly, sensible footballers will invest their money, run pubs, have businesses. Some are also middle class, so they can go on and do sort of different things or return to different non-working class trades. So when they join up, they're pretty much treated as sort of like, relatively ordinary, and footballers themselves had that agency to choose where they serve. So particularly I think what I found from some of my research was pre-conscription, they were more likely to go into the infantry, because I think they're following that general trend of wanting to join up with their mates, because some of them join up with their mates from a club, others join up with their friendship groups outside of football, because for some, football is will be a big thing. It will be the central point. Say if you're down to the semi-pro level, it's you might join up with some of the players from your club, but you're more likely to join up with say me and Chris work in a factory together. That's actually the connection where we might join up with other mates, and so you do see that at times. It's sort of in death, sadly, sort of where you see that celebrity side, because obviously it's that part of their identity. They are Chris is the famous footballer locally, and if he's played at a professional level, I played for yeah. If Chris has played for several clubs, then he will be sadly mourned across several different areas. Or if it's down to the very local level, there's you could do whole more, especially with digitisation, unpacking and finding that at the very local level of newspaper reporting, in their very early 20s, might work at a factory and being star striker for the local town or village side, is that actually that one bit of identity out of, say, church or work or boys brigade or things like that. So there's that element to celebrity. But actually, when they're within the army, there is an element of, to a degree, that they are prized assets for some units, because obviously army officers like to have very successful forms of regimental sports and other things like that. A good football team is always good for spirit de corps, if I pronounced that wrong or badly. So, especially in 1916, I came across this lovely example of the Royal Field Artillery up at Preston having quite a number of footballers come through there, through to do some particular development of recruiting in their area. I think they had quite a number of Derby conscripts. So that would be sort of obviously married players who had committed to conscription when it came through, and so they, relative from the northwest, they get sort of pulled together into this Preston barracks. And obviously there's one particular officer, Lieutenant Shepherd, is suddenly wow, I've got enough internationals for 2 teams here, kind of thing, or first professional players. I am onto something here. So his unit, the couple of teams from these batteries start playing a couple of friendlies against Bolton Wanderers for the professional sides. They do charity matches, and so then you get this sort of they're doing artillery training, which obviously would take a bit longer than infantry training. But they're still there in early 1917. They've been around for a while, and so at a local tribunal case nearby, someone gets up for a civilian and goes I'm not sure why my client should be in the army when there are so many professional footballers still in training at the Preston Forward barracks. This gets some press attention, and that leads very quickly to everyone being off to France with about 48 hours of someone making a decision, because this is bad PR. So that's just one example of sort of it. But another element, you get sort of players being allowed to play on leave whilst in training at weekends for the major teams that are continuing. And again, you get some accounts after the war, like Tom Boyler plays for Burnley, who was the first man to receive the FA Cup from a reigning monarch in 1914 at the Royal Cup final. And so he's quite open in a post-war autobiography, serialised autobiography, where he goes, football earned me many perks, and I took full advantage, which meant a weekend pass extended from Friday lunchtime to somewhere on Monday. It's and then so the army, after a little while, realises that there's bad press around this. I think as the war gets more, in the sense their attitude to it gets more serious through 1718, so then it becomes harder for players to get long passes, which then means that they just bunk off. And you again, post-war, they get players again saying came up with a reason to get away, and I had to dodge the military police at York train station when they were checking down the train to make sure everyone's got their weekend pass. And also then they would play under false names, so then they'd be AN other, or Joe blogs or whatever, that kind of stuff, like Jay Smith, And some of the newspaper correspondents hated it because they'd be put in this really bad position because they'd recognise these players and then be given a team sheet, and it's like, that's not James Smith. It's like, like you get someone literally to reverse the name with the initials. It's at that level of sort of.
It's an interesting sidelight on Adrian Gregory's economies of sacrifice, isn't it? The extent to which being a footballer gives you a certain amount of license, by the sound of it, just to misbehave.
Yeah, exactly. So although it's licensed as sort of as coming down from the military on high, so to speak.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's sort of semi-official license. But
my favourite one is on that one. It is an English player who'd moved to playing for Rangers in Scotland, Glasgow Rangers, and so he's again in his artillery side. And in Scotland, they also had a history of playing smaller 5-6-side tournaments. And so there's a smaller form tournament that's going to have representative sides between Rangers, Celtic, one or two other Scottish clubs, and then an army side of which he's going to be part of, this player. But because he's with Rangers, say like, oh, do you want to come play for us? You're part of our side. So he goes to his commanding officer, says like, can I play for Rangers? And it's along the lines of like, if you play for the blankety blank Rangers, I'll make sure that you'll be blankety blank in France before your blankety blank feet can touch the ground, kind of thing.
I was about to say, a football match or a series of football matches involving Rangers, Celtic and the Army. What could possibly go wrong? And
so the pithy end to that one is just like, I decided to play for the Army, which was a wise decision, I'm sure. So that's, never underestimate sort of competitiveness of like NCOs and junior officers in keeping hold of their players. They clearly got nothing on like, a Jose Mourinho.
Are there any clubs that are particularly hard hit by either losing players into the army for 4 or 5 years or players who get killed and don't come back? I hesitate to use the phrase golden generation because football fans of a certain age will wince about it. But are there any teams who have clearly got a very good group of players and then miss out on the opportunity to probably have done everything they would have done with them because of the war and are then, dramatically suffer for it afterwards?
It's interesting, sort of partly, I'm trying to think sort of like, it's interesting sort of think of the dynamics where trying to work out. That's a bit, I'd almost like need to dig down 13, 14 like season previews and sort of see where the trajectory of where different teams were going. Where clubs sort of lose out most is not to downplay it, but there are, I think when I looked into the stats, actually quite a large chunk of the major professional clubs don't lose a player, which obviously is just a reflection of some of the wider research that's been done into sort of the demographic impact of the war. Some clubs lose a couple of players. You have some clubs that might lose 2 or 3, and I think Middlesbrough, Newcastle, and other clubs have to forgive me. I can't quite remember which ones, but I found about 4 or 5 that had lost 4 or 5 players. But it's almost hard to say in terms of like losing a generation. I don't think there's a generational loss in that sense, because obviously what you're really talking about in some ways is that loss that we can't really sort of quantify or really know too much about is amongst reserve players, because when you look at professional senior players who played a first team appearance, quite a number have come back, quite a number have continued playing after the war. What they've lost is time. Crucially, it's younger players where you have the more devastating loss of either being killed before they can break through, and that's very hard to quantify in terms of like, would they have gone and succeeded? Would they have had that breakthrough? But then that being more vulnerable to the dislocation of lost years coming back and not being recognised, but not being really wanted by their club. And a great example of that is where we do know where someone managed to overcome that is Sam Wadsworth, who was a young player for Blackburn Rovers pre-First World War. Very poignant story. I struggled a little bit with my voice when telling it because he was basically playing for the champions of England. So it'd be like playing for Manchester City, coming through, being like almost like a Foden kind of figure being brought through. He lies about his age to join up. I've seen that. It's not one of those ones because I got this story from him recounting it after the war, recounting his life story in the 50s, just reading off the manuscript almost, which is quite something when you hear it, as I did in a very cold Northwest Sound archive with about 3 layers on back in the day, about 14 years ago. So he lies about his age. He joins up, he serves about 4 years on the Western Front. His brother's killed. He comes back, and then Blackburn Rovers' response is sadly to say, "We're really sorry, we haven't got a spot for you, so you can have a free transfer," which is obviously anyone who's gone through that kind of stuff, that is like heartbreaking. So he went back home and he talks about literally being ready to throw his boots on the fire, just like give up with football completely. That's the thing we don't know, is how many other Sam Wadsworth were in that particular scenario where they were just like, they've gone through the war, but that chance of breaking through is gone. And quite fortunately, his father, who was a former rugby league player, I think quite strong-willed, convinced him to give it another go. Started off playing locally. And that's the other thing. He started off playing locally, and that's what many of the other young players might have done. Played locally, just not gone on. It'd been the classic, like, oh yeah, he was with Rovers before the war, but didn't make that breakthrough, which is something that is still common. That's still part of football culture all the time. But then he fortunately got spotted, went to Huddersfield Town, was winning like an FA Cup a couple of years with him being released by Blackburn Rovers, and then won 3 league titles. So I'm captain England. So when he was at Huddersfield, he also played alongside another player who'd been released, Tom Wilson, who'd been badly injured his knee while serving the Western Front with the DLI. And he came back, and Sunderland, who had a bit of a track record on this because they played him in one game and he was unfit, having put on weight in the army. So he'd come back over a little bit overweight and injured, and they played him in the game. And they also played another young player, Jimmy Seed, who'd been playing with Wilson in the reserves pre-First World War. And Jimmy Seed had been gassed twice and still was recovering from that. And they played him because they were a bit short. And they played both one game, took a look at them and went like, yes, really sorry. Free transfers for you both. There's not a spot for you, really. And they both went on. Tom Wilson went on to Huddersfield and also won back-to-back titles. He was their captain. And Jimmy Seed played for Spurs. He actually went to South Wales, resurrected his career playing in the Welsh leagues, and then went to Tottenham and then Sheffield Wednesday. That's my not to digress too much, but that's one of my favourite little ones, because Tottenham eventually decided to get rid of him after he'd helped them win like cups and the FA Cup and Second Division. And they had a dispute when he was getting older about his wages. So he went to Sheffield Wednesday because they wouldn't pay him the money that he still wanted to be paying. After he left, Tottenham had this massive drop in loss of form. Sheffield Wednesday were in relegation form and went this upward track with Jimmy Seed. So Tottenham got relegated. Sheffield Wednesday survived, and then Sheffield Wednesday won 2 back-to-back First Division titles the next following seasons. They did basically a Leicester, but for 2 years running.
It's nice to know that Tottenham maintain the same kind of farcical standards throughout time that they continue to into the modern day.
Jimmy C put it like, Tottenham were relegated for the want of paying me £2 a week extra. Great way of summarising it.
More broadly, to what extent does football in British society, in general, change or not change after the war? Is the war a paradigm shift? I suppose this question we ask about the war in all aspects of things. Is that true for football, or like many of these things, is the change not there immediately after? I'm just wondering how much it affects football.
I think what's interesting is the war is this, especially around this issue of professionalism, by making players amateur during the war. The FA really flips it around during the war. They essentially go back, and there is, within the debates around it, there is this idea of like we're returning it almost to its purer days. And so some journalists debate this, say like, what after the war can we keep on this? Can we, if we have to have money, can players still have jobs like they used to do in the 1870s? Can this be a way to essentially get rid of some of the torrid commercialism that has engulfed the game, of which, it should be said, mainly middle-class writers are sort of, it's a preconception for them or an issue of debate. And obviously, if you had more working-class people, voices within that might have a different perspective, or as you do see with players. So the war is this huge shift in terms of just how the game is organised, and by forcing working-class men to be subscribed to these amateur middle-class values, which it should be said is really, what I find is, this is the big thing, it's really worth drawing out. It's completely different to, say, the theatre or the musical or essentially any other professional entertainment during the war, which is allowed, you don't have actors being forced to get up on the stage and act for free, and you have jockeys being continued to paid to race racehorses. Even county cricketers, where county cricket is shut down, Yorkshire Cricket Club still pays its professional cricketers their wages during the war. So they are literally paid while not to play cricket. Makes sense. Whereas footballers sit in this very unique little sort of particular area where they are forced to subscribe to this. And partly that's the public pressure that the FA feels it's under, especially from the 14-15 season. And so it's basically, we're going to cut out this area of opposition to us therefore no one can really criticise this, or they still end up having criticisms for various different reasons. And so, but then at the end of the war, it is almost returned back to normal. And what's quite interesting is comparative to the Second World War. In the Second World War, the FA, under Stanley Rouse, who'd served in the First World War himself came from a lower middle class background. He was like doing teacher training. He volunteers. He serves with the Royal Artillery in Egypt, Palestine, and France. And he's much a moderniser, so he's a younger man. So as the FA secretary in the Second World War, he's coming up with new plans to modernise the FA, to encourage it to rejoin FIFA, which it's left after the First World War. Whereas in the First World War, the FA officials are much older, and they are very much about looking backwards to a pre-First World War era. And then after the war, it's essentially a restoration of the status quo with perhaps some slight changes. You have the expansion of the Football League, so you have more of the league structure that we're familiar with today, because it's still a bit of a regional divide on that. So, but the one big thing that does come out of the war, which is sort of interesting in the for those of you familiar with the European Super League from debates from last year, which was obviously about a small cabal of clubs coming together to make sure that all the money that's in the game is not distributed amongst the other clubs. It's fairly distributed amongst those most deserving, i.e. the richest at the top, because they generate the money. Or I think that was the argument. They may have to excuse me if I've paraphrased them badly. But what you have coming out of the First World War is that because of the problems of trying to run football clubs during the war on lower crowds and unequal distribution of crowds, is they introduced gate sharing or pooling. So an element of each gate gets shared by the two clubs. And so that comes in during the war. It's seen as a temporary measure, and then it lasts all the way up to 1983. And when it's taken away, that's the precursor to the modern sort of what you might call hyper-commercialisation of the modern game, which is less sort of about sharing the money to help each other in that communal way. So yeah, sorry, that's a sort of windy way into saying like not very much does seem to have changed apart from one this crucial thing within it, so to speak.
Thinking of audiences, I was very struck by, you opened talking about those pictures where, you were reflecting on the extent to which the people on the terraces would have been ex-service or have lived through the war. And my first exposure to British football as popular culture was actually through the opening scene of J.B. Priestley's The Good Companions, which is one of my favourite scenes in popular literature of the period. It's so evocative. So I was, and 1929, it's very much within that war books boom, even if it isn't directly about the war itself. So I was just wondering, is there a cultural change, not just within football hierarchies and structures, and for those professionally or as amateurs involved in the game, but for audiences as well and for crowds? Does the war have any effect on that?
What you see after the First World War, in the same way after the Second, is you have a very definite, clear post-war boom in attendance numbers, because obviously it's again people who haven't been able to attend coming back and flocking to these sports, and then also being essentially a little bit more up for entertainment and escapism after the sort of after the restrictions of the wartime period. So you see this big boom, because obviously the other thing that is the potential for change, but then it's cut off. And again, I would probably argue a lot of the post-war is about this restoring the status quo, and that's obviously around women's football. So you have a sort of a bit of a little drop off with women's football games in 1919 as women come out of the workforce, and they're sort of losing access to games and also the communities they formed. And then through 1920 and 21, you have a growth of women's football, of games. And it's interesting because some of the debates around the reason for the introduction of the ban, the FA's ban talks about it being an unsuitable sport. So there's explicit sexism there. It mentions issues around the fundraising aspects of women's games, which is a subject to do more research into. It's about, I think, that actually comes out of the First World War in a sense that obviously there is the broader issue of during the First World War in the charity fundraising of, is fundraising done properly? Is there the potential for exploitation? Because obviously a number of First World War charities are exploited in different ways, or individuals exploit them. And so there are elements of the FA, having had that role in having to monitor wartime charity games, continue to do that in the post-First World War, which they also did pre-First World War as well. That was one of their roles. And so that's actually an issue of male FA administrators with the men who are involved in the fundraising side of women's games. It's about like the division of expenses. How is it paid? What's the percentage going to charity? But some people have also argued that women's football is seen as a threat to the commercial success of men's football in the post First World War era. And what I'd say, having done a little bit of initial research, this is almost beyond after the book, is that actually what you've got is a broader boom in wartime audiences. People are going to games where they are for male or female players. So I wouldn't personally subscribe to that argument too much. I think it's something that needs to be looked into or understood, because women's tendencies are rising, but so are men's, and you're having some really big. When Dick Keir's ladies play their famous game against on Boxing Day in 1920, when they get a crowd that's up to about 46,000, some reports are up to 53. What's interesting is actually, if you look on that day on Boxing Day, there's about another 4 or 5 games that are the same or even bigger. I think there's about 70,000 at Old Trafford, I think it is, potentially. So actually there's space for everyone potentially within that, or you can see how there could be space for everyone. It's actually, I think it fundamentally comes down to it's the sexism, which we don't want women in men's spaces playing the sport. They're all right to come along and watch, is kind of the underlining a little bit with it. And you can see a bit of a boom, I think, a little post-war boom in female spectatorship. But again, that existed pre-First World War. So with some of these things, it's very hard to understand. Crowds are very difficult because it's a lot of judging various different types of evidence, whether it's be visual and data, and it's understanding, again, back to what I was saying before, like local, regional, national variations, and also then what people are, especially when it's descriptive descriptions, it's about understanding where that person's coming from and whether they've got an axe to grind or not, I think, as well.
In regards to football post-war, so obviously, the various of the footballers you've talked about have been kind of England captain, or they've captained England, or they played for England, and how long does it take for international football matches between competent nations to begin to appear? Because obviously nowadays England cannot play Germany without the press rooting up every Second World War cliche imaginable until, a generation of historians are scream forever into the abyss.
Which in of itself is an interesting one, because that whole reference to the war, probably not a surprise to you, sort of like wartime reference within England-Germany matches as something that's developed more through the 20th century. Yeah. So you did get elements of it within the mid-20th century, but you can look at like 1966 coverage, and it's whirled away from 1996. Because when I was, you may hate me for this, when I was doing my not even GCSEs, it would be pre-GCSEs, I think, around then. We had a really great English teacher. Big shout out to Mr. Oliver. He was fantastic. And so he had us going through just looking at tabloid news coverage. And so he literally obviously went out and like, wow, this is great. The Sun and the Mirror and everyone, the Express, everyone else was like, so kids, what can we learn from Stuart Pearce and the World War II helmet kind of thing? That kind of stuff. And that was peak tabloid war references. So that's kind of come in. So, but after the First World War, they had a pretty FA, the English FA and the home nations as a whole agreed that they would not play the central teams from the Central Powers, and they left FIFA. I think after they left, not a huge expert on this, but they did leave FIFA around that time, around 1920, over the issue. They had a very strict interpretation at one point, and it should also be added, France and Belgium and Luxembourg also joined, or France and Belgium joined them in this desire not to play the Central Powers. And so at one point they also had a very strict ruling on this, because not only could their clubs not play a team from Austria or Germany, they also could not play a team from France if a team from France had played a team from Germany. It was like by degrees removed, like several degrees of like, we don't want to be tainted by any type of association. And then obviously that was an issue for neutral teams, because they were like, well, hang on, I'm from Denmark and we didn't fight anyone. But my team goes to Germany and plays, but then wants to go and play you back in Denmark against an English team touring there. We can't do that. Right. That might be a bit tricky for us. So they go out, they come back in a little bit, and then they leave FIFA again in the mid-20s, and that's over the issue of professionalism, because in some European nations, they still didn't have professionalism, or they allowed heavy expenses to amateurs. And again, you had this very strong amateur element with the FA that was like, no. strict expenses only, no broken time whatsoever, which is the where basically you're paid for the time you give up of a say. Have to give up your Saturday morning shift to be able to play across the Saturday because you have to travel Saturday morning. And they were like, nope, not having that. And so they left FIFA over that for quite a little while, and hence partly why England didn't participate in the first World Cups. They were invited, but they also just didn't want to go.
Can I ask about remembrance? Because it strikes me that football is a unifying event. It's an event. People come together in their tens of thousands to watch it. It brings people together. And so if you've got thousands of ex-servicemen in stadiums, do these become centres for remembrance? Because the players will have served, the spectators will have served.
You have remembrance within clubs, but that's very much focused around the players from the club or officials who went away. And that's in the same way, similar to workplaces in the sense that you have the war memorial plaques, rolls of honours, these appear, and then they sadly disappear over the decades. So some clubs had them and they'd gone. I remember being at a talk once where Crystal Palace, and I've read about this in the newspaper and I've seen club historians talk about this. Crystal Palace during the war formed one of those great. They had a wooden board set up, and they had photographs of all the players who were on service inset into it. There were all the details of which regiment they joined. And so it sounded like this amazing piece, like artifact. And then it was like removed and like thrown in the skip at some point in the club's history when they got rid of a lot of things. Because that's clubs like other organisations, but clubs have often not been the best protectors of their own heritage and history. Newcastle United, they had a lovely plaque, and at one point it was like in the cupboard in the stadium, but now they actually have it back out in this place. Within that you can do a whole sort of research within that sort of that memory of clubs and the football community engagement with the history and remembrance. But around the war, immediately after the war, stadiums aren't sites for it in remembrance in the way that obviously we do with the minute silence at games. I'd be really fascinated to actually work out quite exactly when that came into the game nearest to Armistice Day, because I imagine that's a very, very relatively modern development.
Yeah, but I suppose first question, would they play a game on Armistice Day to start with? Second, if they did, certainly in the 20s, the country stops. Buses stop. So it would have happened not because it's football, but because everything would have stopped.
What we do is take remembrance into the football setting on a day nearest to it. Whereas back then, it's obviously, as you say, it's very much about that specific day. So I did find that lovely quote that I used in the book where it is the first one. And so a journalist is at Arsenal. So they're actually able to observe the players like everyone else observing that first one. And it's like, as I say, they are in their workplace. They are like other people. They are just stopping what they're doing, just training.
And so there's no sense that it's not appropriate to play a game on the 11th.
It's one of those ones I haven't come across. That would be really frisking through the fixtures, but I haven't come across anything like that or debates. It never cropped up as some things like, because obviously the thing with Armistice Days is that temporary pause of everyday life. Yeah. So people did get on with the rest of their, and obviously I think reading Adrian Gregory's, obviously you had the parties that people used to actually throw in the early period where it was still a day of also jointly celebration as well. So what's quite interesting in terms of sort of remembrance in sort of a broader scale is the sort of the lack of remembrance in terms of support for disabled ex-servicemen who are making it a fan base. So during the war, obviously, like a lot of society, nothing's too good for a wounded soldier. We'll organise trips, we'll get cars, people chip in to provide money for food when wounded servicemen are taken from hospitals to games. They're given the best seats in the house. They're wheeled down to the front. People take the time and effort over them. And then after the war, it's very much it is sort of a bit within the football. Is that part of that cliche of that where they are sort of an afterthought? So some clubs do have passes, which is, free passes. So you can, if you have been disabled in the war, you can have that free pass to get in. I came across that mainly partly through one guy getting done for, who himself was a disabled ex-serviceman, getting done for basically selling them on to people who shouldn't have had them. So we went into a court case. I think it is in prison.
I wonder the extent to which, that, dropping of the special treatment is an extension of that wartime sense of football being part of a civilian identity, and these are men who are looking to, even if they can't entirely because of their disability, but they don't want to hold on to a wartime identity, or the society around them doesn't want them to hold on to a specifically wartime identity.
For me, it's probably because it's again one I've only glimpsed it a little bit through some of the sort of around the issues of access, and it'd be very interesting to know if where someone could research more within the servicemen, ex-servicemen's associations in terms of how they view and approach it. Because again, one of the most sort of again the poignant one was the very first England-Scotland international, which is played at Hillsborough in Sheffield, where I'm from, in 1920. The limbless, I'm trying to get this right. I think it's the Limbless Ex-Servicemen's Association, Lima. That's Lima.
Yeah.
And they specifically contact the FA to say what will your provision will be for us. Because obviously we do have members who will be interested in attending this. It will be a super game, and like they had a huge, massive crowd. And the FA's response is literally just to go very short letter from the notoriously curt Frederick Wall, who had a habit of doing things like this, very much along the lines of like, given the large crowd that will be coming, recommend that they just don't come, basically. Just like, wow.
The FA being out of touch with the footballers and football fans in the country, I can't believe it.
Going back to the previous discussions, he's a man who, I think if I've got this right, he was in charge of also overseeing the expenses for when referees came to like international games and things like that, for England games. And so there was a Belgian referee who came in the early 20s, and so he submitted the expenses, and they were somewhat larger than they had been pre-First World War. At which point he sort of crossed them through and that, went like, this is what they are. The referee said, well, actually, this, prices have risen, stuff like this. It's more expensive. Exchange rates have changed. He went back, sir, the value of the English pound never changes.
Perfect. Brilliant.
So, yeah. So that's Frederick Wall. Yeah. Always wore a very formal man, always wore proper sort of top hat and full formal dress for cup finals.
That modernisation of the FA should be finished any day now.
When Stanley Rouse turned up in the 30s, he's got sort of a bit of I've thought of not dressing down, but sort of pointed out that he was wearing, I think he turned up in rather casual +4s and sort of more like attire suitable for the posh clothes, suitable attire for the golf course, which is like
sporting gentleman.
Yeah, exactly, and that was not suitable attire for the secretary on his first day, of which he was arrested.
So as we've sailed through the hour, it's probably time to put this to bed. Perhaps revisit it some other time. But Chris, as our diary secretary, what are we looking at next time?
I don't know. We're possibly going to be looking. We've been thinking about taking a literary sojourn. So maybe we'll have a couple of literary episodes on the horizon.
Yeah, I'm going to put in a bid to read Tracy Chevalier's Single Thread, because we have, this is a shout out to some new audience members from my stitching group, and I'd love to do something for them about textiles in the First World War. So I'm going to put in a bid for that and see if I can convince Chris and Angus to read a novel about sewing.
It's not Downton Abbey, so I'm already well disposed towards it.
I'll read anything. Well, Alex, thank you for that. That was really good. That was really fascinating. And I guess we'll reconvene in another month or so.
See you then.
Bye, everyone.
Thanks very much for having me on the show.
It's a lovely war.